Marcus Walker, a young black soldier, walks down the dimly lit street after his evening drill. His uniform is perfectly pressed, his shoulders straight, but the weight of daily prejudice he faces hangs heavily on him. The base, located in a small, southern town, is a microcosm of a nation still struggling with deep racial divides. As Marcus turns the corner, the sound of a police car's engine revving catches his attention. Headlights illuminate the empty street, slowly making their way toward him. Marcus pauses, his instincts telling him that something's about to happen. The car stops next to him. Officer Miller leans out of the driver's side, his expression already one of contempt. Marcus remains calm, holding his ground. He pulls out his military ID slowly, as though he's done this 1,000 times before. The officer eyes him suspiciously, his gaze hardening as he takes in Marcus's appearance. The officer challenges Marcus's right to be out past curfew, despite the military ID he presents. Marcus, knowing the officer's intent is more about racism than law enforcement, simply explains that he's headed back to base. The officer ignores the explanation and focuses instead on Marcus's race, his tone dripping with disdain. He accuses Marcus of not belonging in the town, let alone being out at such an hour. The racial animosity is clear, and the officer's words feel like daggers, each one aimed directly at Marcus's sense of identity and worth. Marcus doesn't flinch. He's faced these kinds of interactions countless times before and knows that maintaining composure is his only option. His inner conflict is palpable. He is tired of the constant battle, exhausted from the emotional toll of trying to prove himself time and time again. But he also knows the risks of reacting in anger, of giving the officer the satisfaction of pushing him to a breaking point. The officer continues, escalating his remarks. His words become more personal, questioning Marcus's loyalty and making derogatory comments about Marcus's presence in the military. He's no longer just questioning Marcus's right to be on the streets. He's attacking his very identity, his humanity. Marcus feels his chest tighten with the weight of the insults. It's not just the humiliation of being treated this way by an officer of the law, but the sense that this is how society sees him, as less than, as someone who doesn't deserve the respect that others take for granted. His rage simmers beneath the surface, but he resists the urge to lash out, knowing that such an action would only feed into the narrative of the angry black man, a stereotype he's worked so hard to avoid. The officer makes a final, cutting remark, before turning to his partner, Officer Hayes. Hayes is young, and while he remains silent, there's a visible discomfort on his face. He clearly doesn't agree with what's happening, though he remains silent, caught in a moment of indecision. Hayes looks at Marcus, and for a fleeting second, there's a brief moment of connection, of understanding. But that moment is short-lived, as the older officer dismisses him and takes control again. The officer finally relents, tossing Marcus's military ID back at him, and the two officers drive away. As the car fades into the night, Marcus is left standing there, humiliated, enraged, but still composed. His emotions are a whirlwind of anger, shame, and exhaustion, but he knows that this moment, this constant battle, is far from over. He takes a deep breath, gathering his composure, and begins walking back toward the base. The weight of it all, the continuous questioning of his worth, the systematic racism that seems to follow him everywhere, threatens to break him. Yet he keeps moving forward, step by step. There's no other choice but to keep going. As he walks, he feels the sting of the encounter still fresh, but it doesn't break him. It adds fuel to the fire, a reminder of the work still ahead, the fight that he must continue to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who has been forced to endure the same. In the distance, he notices a figure standing off to the side. It's General Harrison, observing from afar. The general has seen what's happened, and though he hasn't spoken, his presence offers a strange comfort. For a moment, Marcus allows himself to take in the sight of the general, a reminder that not everyone in power is aligned with the prejudices that seem so deeply embedded in the world around him. The general's silent support, though small, means something in that moment. It's the first time in a long while that Marcus feels seen, not just as a soldier, but as a person deserving of respect and dignity. He doesn't say anything, but as he walks past the general, there's a quiet understanding between them. Marcus continues forward, his steps a little steadier, his head held a little higher. It's not a victory yet, but it's a glimmer of hope. Something small, but significant. The road ahead is still long, and the fight is far from over. But in this moment, Marcus feels a flicker of something he hasn't felt in a while. Hope. For several weeks, Marcus Walker's life became a daily cycle of harassment. Each encounter with Officer Miller seemed to be a new battle in a long, relentless war. From the moment Marcus left the base to the moment he returned, Miller would find him, seeking any opportunity to belittle him, questioning his presence in the town, mocking his uniform and calling him derogatory names. The insults were constant. Troublemaker, lazy soldier, just a token black man in a uniform. They rolled off Miller's tongue like a scripted performance. At first, Marcus held his head high, hoping that silence would shield him from Miller's cruelty. But soon, the weight of it became unbearable. The harassment wasn't just limited to Miller's verbal attacks. It was a systematic effort to undermine his dignity and his purpose. He began to feel trapped, cornered, not just by Miller, but by the entire system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. He questioned how long he could continue to serve his country, how long he could wear the uniform with pride, when every step he took in town was met with the same cruelty. And then there was Officer Hayes. Hayes was young, impressionable, and increasingly uncomfortable with the constant mistreatment. The tension was visible in the way he looked at Marcus, the way his eyes would avert whenever Miller launched into another tirade. Hayes felt the weight of his own silence. He knew right from wrong, but he was paralyzed by fear of retribution, fear of isolating himself, fear of the consequences of speaking out. As the weeks dragged on, Marcus could sense Hayes's internal conflict. But the older officer always made it clear that silence was the only way to survive. Hayes might have wanted to do something, but he remained silent. His silence a testament to the struggle so many faced when they tried to stand up against what was wrong. It was this uncomfortable silence, the passivity, that ate at Marcus, leaving him feeling more isolated than ever before. The constant harassment took its toll on Marcus, chipping away at his once unshakable confidence. Every cruel word, every public humiliation eroded the belief he once had that he could be both black and a soldier in a system that demanded perfection. He'd been raised to believe that hard work and dedication would open doors, that it would lead to respect. But with every step, he found himself caught in a maze of prejudice and systemic oppression. Could he truly serve his country? Could he ever rise above the invisible barriers that kept him tethered to a life of humiliation? In the quiet moments when he was alone, Marcus found solace only in his fellow soldiers, those who shared similar burdens. Some were black, others white, but the one thing they all had in common was the understanding of oppression. The soldiers who knew what it was like to be overlooked, dismissed, and discarded. Their stories kept him going, reminding him that he wasn't alone in his struggle, even though it often felt that way. But even they couldn't always shield him from the emotional strain of facing daily hostility. It was during these moments of silence that Marcus began to confide in General Harrison. General Harrison, despite being a high-ranking officer, was not blind to the struggles of his men. He had watched Marcus's quiet strength and resilience from a distance and had begun to see the cracks in the system that Marcus had to endure. Harrison's presence was a small spark of hope for Marcus, a reminder that not all authority figures were blind to the injustice around them. Harrison began inviting Marcus to private meetings, taking an interest in his work and listening to his frustrations. But as much as Harrison listened and offered support, he admitted that he couldn't immediately solve the systemic issues Marcus faced. Change was slow, and it was painfully clear that fighting a system as entrenched as the one they both operated within wouldn't be easy. But Harrison's acknowledgement of Marcus's struggles, his validation, was something Marcus clung to. Yet despite Harrison's support, Marcus still felt the weight of his duties. His leadership skills were called into question during a pivotal training exercise when he was tasked with leading a team of soldiers. He was already facing the tension of Miller's harassment, and now, on the field, Miller's influence seeped into the ranks. The younger soldiers, who already questioned Marcus's authority, were subtly swayed by Miller's poisonous words. They undermined Marcus, whispering doubts, refusing to follow his orders. The exercise, already riddled with tension, ended poorly. The soldiers struggled, their performance faltering under the strain of racial tension. When the exercise was over, Marcus stood at the front, the eyes of his soldiers boring into him. Some soldiers were openly hostile, others too fearful to act. The failure of the exercise was a heavy blow to Marcus's confidence, and the sting of isolation was sharper than ever. He found himself questioning whether he truly belonged, whether the dream he'd fought for, of being a respected officer, was ever possible in this hostile environment. Yet, as he processed the aftermath, Marcus could feel a shift beginning to take place. His understanding of leadership was tested not by the soldiers who rejected him, but by those who stayed silent, those who knew the true cost of standing up. The soldiers who had seen his struggle, some who had experienced their own battles, began to see his worth. Though they didn't speak out, their eyes, their small gestures, became a silent form of support. It was during this time that General Harrison began his own investigation into Miller's actions. The general's awareness of the broader systemic issues deepened as he saw how Miller's behavior wasn't just isolated to the base. It was part of a larger pattern of racism that permeated both the military and the town. Harrison's growing understanding forced him to confront his own role in the system and how far he was willing to go to help dismantle it. Marcus didn't know it yet, but Harrison's awareness would soon change the course of his struggle. Still, there were moments that pushed him to the brink. During a public event, Miller once again humiliated Marcus, mocking his military rank in front of civilians. It was a public shaming that felt like a slap in the face, an open reminder of his place in a world that refused to acknowledge his worth. But Marcus didn't break. Not this time. When he was given the chance to lead a small group of soldiers in a community service project, Marcus took the opportunity to prove himself. It wasn't just about the mission, it was about showing himself and others that he could lead with dignity, even in the face of adversity. The mission was a success, and as they completed their task, Marcus gained the respect of soldiers and civilians alike. This small victory, though not monumental, was the turning point Marcus needed. It was a sign that, despite the weight of his struggles, he had the power to rise above it all. His leadership, his perseverance, had proven that he was more than the labels placed on him. This moment of triumph wasn't just for Marcus. It was a reminder to everyone who witnessed it that, even in the darkest of times, the light of resilience could shine through. It wasn't the end of the fight. The battle was still ahead of him. But it was a beginning, a step toward reclaiming his dignity and finding his place in a world that had tried to break him. Officer Miller stood, arms crossed, a sneer curling across his face as he looked down at Marcus, who stood at attention, his back straight but his insides churning with a mix of anger and helplessness. The crowd, A mix of military officers and civilians gathered around, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. "I've had enough of your attitude, Marcus," Miller spat, his voice rising with each word. "You've been nothing but trouble since the day you got here. You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you? Well, I'm here to tell you, you're not. You're nothing but a disgrace to this uniform." Marcus clenched his fists. At his sides, the words stinging like a slap across his face. The whispers from the crowd seemed to grow louder, and he could feel their eyes on him. He had heard these words before, but they didn't hurt any less. Miller's eyes gleamed with malice as he stepped closer, his voice thick with venom. "I'm demanding your dishonorable discharge. It's time for you to leave. You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The humiliation was overwhelming, and for a moment Marcus felt small, like a target in a world that was determined to bring him down. He wanted to respond, to fight back, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. His future, his entire career, hung in the balance. The stakes had never been higher. Before Marcus could find the words, a strong, commanding voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Miller." The voice belonged to General Harrison, who stepped into the center of the room, his eyes locked on Miller. The weight of his presence silenced the room, and everyone turned to watch the confrontation. "Sir, you've seen what he's done." Miller's voice was sharp, but Harrison's glare was even sharper. "I've seen enough to know that you're abusing your power, Miller," Harrison said, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You've been targeting Marcus for far too long, and I'm done standing by while you perpetuate this kind of behavior. This isn't just about one soldier, it's about a pattern of hatred, of racism that you've gotten away with for far too long." Miller's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. The audience shifted uncomfortably, the room buzzing with the weight of Harrison's words. The soldiers looked at each other, unsure how to react, while the civilians watched in stunned silence. "You think this is just about Marcus? You think you can tear him down and no one will notice?" Harrison continued. "This is about a system that allows people like you to act with impunity. You've been able to mistreat him, and others like him, because this system lets you. But I'm done. I'm calling for a full investigation into your actions and the actions of others who've been part of this. This stops now." Marcus could hardly believe his ears. For a moment, he just stood there, processing the words, feeling as if a weight had been lifted. The validation he hadn't known he needed was coming from someone who held power in this world. Someone who was willing to risk everything for him. But Miller wasn't done. He stepped forward, chest puffed out, defiance written all over his face. "You'll regret this, General. You don't know what you're doing. This isn't the way things work around here." "You're wrong," Harrison said, his voice calm but resolute. "This is exactly how it should work. And if you think I'll back down, you don't know me at all." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was thick with the weight of Harrison's decision. Marcus's heart raced, unsure of what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while he felt a flicker of hope. Harrison's gaze softened as he turned to Marcus, his voice quieter but no less firm. "You don't have to stand alone anymore, son." Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. The emotions bubbled up, a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He had never expected this, never imagined someone in power would stand up for him. Not like this, not so openly, not so fearlessly. The general gave him a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. In that moment, Marcus realized something. He didn't have to fight this battle alone. The silence stretched, then broke as Marcus finally found his voice. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, filled with a quiet determination that had been building within him for months. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice strong, though it shook slightly. "I won't let you silence me anymore. I won't be your scapegoat. I'm here because I earned my place. I didn't ask for your approval, and I don't need it now." The room held its breath, waiting for Miller's reaction. His face was red with rage, but he said nothing. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes locked on Miller. "I am not your enemy. I'm not here to tear anyone down. I'm here to do my job, just like everyone else. But if you think you can break me with your hatred, you're wrong. I will stand tall. I will stand proud. And you will not take that from me." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. The power of his declaration settled over the room, a silent promise that Marcus would no longer be a victim. Harrison smiled slightly, his eyes filled with quiet approval. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, his voice soft but filled with meaning, "for showing us what strength looks like." And just like that, everything changed. Marcus had stood up. He had found his voice, not just in defiance of Miller, but in defiance of a system that tried to keep him silent. In that moment, he reclaimed his dignity and his humanity. As the crowd began to slowly disperse, some eyes filled with a new respect for Marcus, others lingering on Harrison, unsure of what would come next. The old guard, the ones who had enabled this behavior for so long, were now confronted with something they couldn't ignore. They couldn't look away from the truth any longer. Marcus stood tall, his future uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had taken a stand, and that was the first step in reclaiming everything that had been stolen from him. As the room emptied, Harrison approached him again, his voice a quiet reassurance. "We'll do what's right, Marcus. You won't be silenced." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with a newfound sense of pride. "No, I won't." Miller sat slumped in the small, dimly lit office, his once confident posture now sagging under the weight of the papers in front of him. The words on the official notice were clear, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. "Officer Miller is hereby relieved of his duties due to gross misconduct and violations of department protocol." He gripped the paper, crumpling it slightly as the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. The door creaked open, and the voice of the chief broke through his daze. "You're done, Miller. The investigation's complete. You're out." Miller's eyes shot up, his face pale but furious. "This isn't over. You can't—" "We have evidence, Miller. It's not just about Marcus. It's the whole damn department. Your entire history is under review now, and there's nowhere for you to hide." The chief's tone was cold, devoid of sympathy. Miller stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a setup. You're making a mistake." "You made the mistake long before this. You've created an atmosphere of fear and hatred. You've been given too many chances, but you crossed a line this time, and now you're gone. It's not just your future on the line anymore. It's everyone's." As Miller stormed out of the room, his footsteps were heavy, echoing, with the realization that he had nowhere left to run. The system he thought he controlled was turning its back on him, exposing the very rot he had helped to fester. Hayes sat in the quiet of his car, his hands gripped tightly around the steering wheel. The investigation had brought so many things to light, and he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He had seen it. The prejudice, the little things that everyone had turned a blind eye to. But his eyes had been opened now, and he could no longer justify it. The faces of Marcus, of the other men and women who had been mistreated, flashed in his mind. He had stood by, silently complicit in a system that harmed people he knew were good, strong, and deserving of respect. He could feel the weight of his own complicity pressing down on him like an anchor, and the suffocating silence in the car mirrored the one he had felt for so long in his own conscience. With a deep, shaky breath, Hayes reached for his phone and dialed the number he had been avoiding for days. "Hello, Chief? It's Hayes. I'm putting in my resignation." There was a long pause on the other end before the chief responded, his voice filled with disbelief. Hayes, you've been with us for 5 years. What's this about? I can't do it anymore. I can't be a part of this. I need to find a different way. A better way. You're making a huge mistake. You're throwing your future away. I don't think I am. Not anymore. He hung up before the chief could say more, knowing this was the right choice, even if it meant walking away from everything he had known. He had to find a new path, one that didn't uphold the injustices he had once ignored. Back at the base, Marcus stood tall, the weight of the past few days still heavy on his shoulders, but no longer crushing him. Word had spread quickly. His name, once whispered in shame, was now being spoken with respect. Soldiers and civilians alike were turning to him for guidance, his struggle becoming their own. His victory was more than just his personal redemption. It was the spark of something much bigger. A younger soldier approached him, his steps hesitant but determined. "Sir, Marcus, I just wanted to say thank you. Your story gave me the courage to stand up to what's been happening around here. I've been quiet too long, and I won't stay silent anymore." Marcus placed a hand on the soldier's shoulder, his voice steady, filled with purpose. "You're not alone. None of us are. We all have a part to play in making this place better. Stand tall, be proud. It's not easy, but we're changing things, one step at a time." The young man nodded, his face breaking into a smile of newfound hope. The shift was beginning, small but powerful. General Harrison stood in his office, the weight of the past few weeks still pressing on him. There had been criticism, whispers behind his back, and disapproving stares, but none of it had broken him. He had done what was right, even when it meant standing alone. He picked up the letter that had come just hours ago, a letter from the highest command, acknowledging his courage but also hinting at the challenges he would face moving forward. They had called his actions controversial, and some even suggested he had jeopardized his career. But he wasn't concerned with his career. He was concerned with something much more important. His phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. It was Marcus. "General, I just wanted to say thank you. I don't think I've ever truly understood what it means to stand up for something bigger than myself. Until now." "You don't have to thank me, Marcus. You've already done that for all of us. You've shown us what real courage looks like. Now, you're helping others see it too." There was a pause, and Marcus's voice came through with an unmistakable strength. "I don't plan to stop anytime soon. If anything, this is just the beginning." Marcus stood at the front of a new group of soldiers, all eyes fixed on him, their faces filled with curiosity and, for some, admiration. He had become something more than just a soldier. He had become a voice for those who had none, a guide for those lost in a system that didn't care for them. He could feel the weight of his transformation. The man he was before, the one who had silently endured, was no longer. The challenges had shaped him, yes, but they had also empowered him to make a difference, to fight for justice, not just with words, but with actions. "Today I want to talk to you about standing up for what's right," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "I know it's hard. I know the system can seem impossible to fight, but each of you, every one of you, has the power to make things better. And it starts with you. It starts with how you treat the person next to you and how you stand up when you see something wrong." The soldiers listened intently, his words sinking in, inspiring a shift in the air. Marcus had not only found his voice, he was helping others find theirs. As Marcus walked away from the base that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. There was still work to be done, there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, and now he was part of something bigger than himself. His story, once one of Struggle had become one of triumph, a beacon for others who had faced the same injustices. He had fought for his dignity, and in doing so, he had sparked a movement that would echo for years to come. As the last light of the sunset touched the sky, Marcus took a deep breath. He was ready for the battles ahead, ready for the change he knew he could help create, one act of defiance at a time. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hope.